Hello and welcome to That Nerd Thing, where we uncover the magical impact that fandoms have on our lives. I'm Morgan, and it's still a little surreal to me that people are actually emailing me asking to be on the show. And usually when people do that, I like to look into what they're interested in, see if they have any work that I could check out, because it's really important to me that when I bring somebody on the show, I know a bit about them, especially if there's somebody who is putting work out into the world. And so I was really excited because today's guest is actually a horror author. He emailed me some stuff and I checked it out, and I'm just so excited to talk about it and his journey. So I would love to introduce horror author Eric Otero. Welcome, Eric.
Hi.
I want to give a little caveat. So I used to really love scary things and horror. I love Halloween. And then for some reason, as I've gotten older, horror has started to really scare me a bit more. And I think it's because maybe with the advancement of technology, things are a little more realistic. But I still am so fascinated by it. But I read your short story called Water Mining in the book Body Horror Anthology, and I'm going to share a link to that in the show notes. And oh my God, I was reading it in bed at night, and I was physically cringing. I wanted to push the book out of my face. And I was like, this is a reflection, I think, of how well written it is and how you really got into the horror of it. As soon as I finished that, I'm like, okay, I'm emailing him yes, I want you on my show.
Well, that's awesome. It was kind of insecure, really, because I never really did. It was, a themed submission, and I wanted to get in with this publisher. So, I was trying to see what they had and all that. And then I was like, I think I could do that because my novel and body horror bits in it. And it's something that I've always been fascinated with as well, just the corruption of the human form in a lot of ways. So I just went in and I was like, okay, I had this rough idea of a story about a guy who gets infected by something and he doesn't know what it is. And it was an alien parasite, more or less. And I was like, I have this kind of started. Let me just kind of go in more in that direction. And I'm really happy that you enjoyed it because it was one of the ones I always write before I go to bed, and I work a blue collar job, so I'm always extremely tired and caffeinated, staying up. And so when I write, it's kind of in a daze all the time. So I don't know. I'm just happy you liked it.
Oh, that's so fascinating. So I've seen you have some other work that's out now too. Do you want to tell us about it?
I have Between the Panels, which is kind of inspired by my blue collar job. I just remember mowing between solar panels and just the idea of being like, okay, 10 feet that way, I have no idea what's there. 10 feet that way, I have no idea what's there. All I got is this row. And it's a pretty long row. It's maybe 2 football fields in length. And, it's kind of mesmerizing just going back and forth doing that. And grasshoppers are jumping on you and all that. It's just, there's a lot going on at the same time, but you can also kind of lose focus of what you're doing. And what's it called when you're driving and you just get to your destination, you don't know how you got there.
Yeah.
That
autopilot.
Sort of yeah. So in this story, I never give the name of the main character because I don't know. I just found in blue collar work, people just get forgotten about. You're just in the background a lot of time. So he gets a job mowing solar panels, and it's miles and miles of it. And as he's doing it, he's kind of just noticing things oh, this is kind of weird. They tell me to report damage to the panels, and I never see it. And if I do report it, it's fixed, I never see anyone else. And just a lot of peculiar things. And the more he pays attention, the more things get weirder and weirder. And it basically just progresses in that direction of kind of cosmic horror of just not knowing what's around you, and it slowly reveals itself, that sort of thing. Don't want to get too spoilery on it,
Cool.
It's on Unveiling Nightmares. It's on their Nightmare downloads. So for $3, you can get a PDF of it. It's their way to kind of go around Amazon and all that so they can get more royalties for the writers and for them.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I'll definitely share a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you. I do have one other story that's also blue collar related, Eye of the Blizzard, which you can get on Amazon and on Psychotoxins Press. They have their whole subscription service. I work as a groundskeeper. I mow, and in the winter I plow. So this just was another anthology that just ended up not accepting it. But it was, about the cold, dealing with the cold and all that. And I work out in the cold all the time. So it's I can kind of tailor this to it. And I just looked up folklore of monsters that are in the cold or that sort of stuff. And I came across the Izurok, which is a shapeshifter that is usually more trickster. What it's known for is taking children and just leaving them in the wilderness and not harming them, not doing anything like that, just leaving them out there. And, obviously they're going to die if no one finds them. But also when like hunters encounter them, it's always, bad situation and all that. Another thing about them is that whenever someone encounters them, as soon as they leave, they immediately forget. So they kind of exist just outside of memory. And the only way you can kind of find out about them is being told about them by someone who has heard the stories, not someone who's directly been involved. And the only thing with their shape-shifting abilities that gives them away is the fact that their eyes and mouth are sideways. So they always try to hide their eyes and their mouth whenever they're revealing themselves.
Wow, that's so interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah. When I, just looked at it, I was like, I have to use this one. It also feels kind of like right out of campy kind of horror, like 80s movies where there'll just be like one weird thing. And I could just imagine the kind of like practical effect makeup of it.
Yeah, that's really neat. Where did you say we could find this story?
That's on Amazon. And you can also subscribe to Psychotoxin Press iTales, and you get access to their entire catalog.
Cool. Are you ready to jump into your nerdy identity?
Absolutely.
What was the first thing that you were nerdy about?
I think like a lot of boys of my generation, I'm just turned 30, so 90s kid all the way, was like Power Rangers and, kind of stuff along that line. And the thing with that was I really liked the robots and like the Zords and all that. I had a bunch of those. And that was the part that really I liked more than anything else. And then in 2000, Toonami on Cartoon Network came out with Gundam Wing, which fascinated me immediately by the trailers and all that. They were releasing it, and that was giant robots fighting each other and all that. And for 6-year-old me, I was all for it. And I became obsessed with that more than anything else.
I remember when you first emailed me, you mentioned that you can get really nerdy about that. And I've never heard of it. So I asked my husband, I was like, have you heard of this? He's like, oh yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about, like with what you were writing. And I was like, oh, okay, sounds good. So that was something you were really into.
It was. And actually part of the reason a lot of people don't know about it is the fact that the original show was being released and 9/11 happened. And Gundam always deals with very heavy themes of like war and terror and how people deal with it. It's not like Power Rangers where, it's like, oh, we're fighting the next big monster. The first episode of the original show features a terrorist attack. And in the opening credits of it, it's this monologue about how this war started because these space colonies wanted independence from Earth. And so they started a war. And 6 months into the war, half the population is dead. And they're at a stalemate. And that is the first 2 minutes of watching the show. You just thrown into that. And then the first episode ends with the main character, Amuro, who is 15, we're watching basically a group of civilians get slaughtered by a giant robot. And he gets into the Gundam, which is the titular robot of the show, to defend his friends and, the people that are surviving. It basically follows the refugees of this colony into war, more or less. They all get just thrown into it, and they end up becoming like a success story in there, but they're all dealing with trauma. And the entire time they have refugees, they're picking up more, dropping them off. What I really liked about it, even as like a 7-year-old, was that even though he had, the Gundam, he was the main character, he was a small part of that war. All the events that they did may have turned the war, but it was a very, very small aspect of it. He wasn't the hero saving the universe. He was someone just trying to survive.
Wow. It sounds like it was a very deep show.
It was. And the creator of it, he made it in response to Star Wars in a lot of ways because he really liked the vast science fiction world he was creating. And all the creators of it were kids when World War II happened. So that heavily inspired the show. Because of that, there was very, very accurate descriptions of trauma and PTSD that they didn't have names for it yet. It was meant for like 7 to 10-year-olds, which blows my mind. But the main thing with it was a lot of Japanese shows, because it's an anime, they were like, hey, we want to launch toys. Make a show around the toys. And so the toy companies had a huge influence in it, to the point where the creator, Yoshiyuki Tomino, was getting extremely frustrated because he wanted like a real grounded war story. And they're like, what'd be cool if the Gundam had a mace? And he was like, no, but he had to do it because they had to sell toys.
Wow. That's really interesting. You do know a lot of that history. How would you say that shaped your writing?
I mean, just the robot aspect of it, because my novel deals with that. Like it's within the mecha genre. They're pilots of these robots in there. And I've always been a fan of horror in unexpected places. So one thing that Gundam did, and especially in that original show, was it would randomly show the bad guy's point of view or the people he's fighting, and they would always shoot it like it's a monster movie or a kaiju movie. The Gundam was always this thing of terror showing up, and to the point where it was nicknamed the White Devil. That kind of fascinated me, and I just really wanted to capture that aspect of, even though you're in this thing designed for war, you can still experience terror. And like, again, like the main character in my novel is not the hero by any means. He is someone that is in the situation trying to survive.
Wow. Can you tell listeners what exactly, because I had to ask my husband this, what is Mecha?
Mecha is like a genre that kind of started in Japan, where it is all around giant robots, basically. It can be, like Astro Boy is technically Mecha because he's an android. There was Gigantor, which is a remote controlled robot. And then the stuff that I got into was dubbed real robot, which was grounded on military. And it was like, we want these to be like, basically, instead of airplanes or tanks, they have robots.
Okay. What is your favorite nerdy thing?
I mean, I think it's kind of obvious it's Gundam in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I have novels. I have model kits I've built. I listen to a podcast about it, kind of like a Mugglecast. They do a similar thing where they go through every single episode and they talk about the themes. They also go into the details of what is happening at the time that is recording, at the show was made, and how that's influencing it, and things in the show and where that could come from. It's kind of like a contemporary culture podcast as much as it is about Gundam. And they have jumping off points all the time because it's still ongoing, because Gundam, there's 40 years of it. They just talked about the bubble economy in Japan and how that influenced like women in the workplace and how their perception was and how that was changing with the new generations, and how there was like this rejection of the working woman that was working even though she was a mom. Like they were supposed to give up their work identity once it became mom. They were supposed to care about themselves. And, you don't think listening to a podcast about giant shoot 'em up robots that they're getting that deep, but they do every time.
What's the name of the podcast? I would love for listeners to know about it.
It's Mobile Suit Breakdown.
Mobile Suit Breakdown?
Yes. And the Gundam's not in the name, but it's called Mobile Suit Gundam because the robots in it, the overarching umbrella term is Mobile Suit.
Okay.
Yeah, which was actually taken from Starship Troopers, which I would not have known if I had not listened to that podcast.
It's amazing finding podcasts that talk about the things that we love.
It really is. And I started listening to another one about a book series that I am getting close to finishing. It's really heavy, and no one around me is remotely as nerdy as me. So I'm like talking about this book series to people that have never read it and probably never will. It's nice to have that like parasocial relationship of someone else experiencing the same thing as you, even though you can't really have a conversation with them.
Yeah. So what's the book series?
The Second Apocalypse series by R. Scott Baker.
Okay. And what's the podcast?
That one is Page Tour. They just go through different series with like a cast of people. And I'm just listening to the chunk about this book series.
That's awesome. So that's great, though, that you've found these resources online where you can really embrace your nerdiness.
Yeah, especially since I found being a nerd being particularly isolating, because I live in a small town and there wasn't very many people like that were into that at all. And I was one of the few people that was a reader. I was one of the few people that really got into like video games and that stuff. So it was isolating, but it was also like this secret little thing that I had to myself that no one else could take from me.
What are you currently nerdy about?
That book series, and again, as always, the through line is Gundam. But that book series in particular, it's also a huge influence on me because I've read it once before, and I'm always a firm believer that some books, there's a time and a place where they will hit you differently. And I don't know what it is, but the first time I read like the first two books, and I was like, oh, this is cool, but I didn't get into it. And I started rereading them, or listening to them actually, because I listen to audiobooks a lot while at work last summer. And I got fully invested to the point where I didn't want to like binge them. I've been slowly listening to them and reading them and doing that as time goes on. And the way I can describe it is that it is essentially like a morbid, grimdark version of Lord of the Rings, but where one of the main characters is a Christ figure that after he gets crucified becomes essentially Genghis Khan. It's a fantasy story set in this region called Erwa, and the big bad in it is essentially Lovecraftian cosmic horror entity that's just become like mythological at the point, because there was a battle at one point and, they won just barely, and then humanity forgot, more or less, except for the sorcerers that when they become a sorcerer, they inherit the memories and dreams of one of the people who fought against the
Oh.
console, is what they're called. And so they relive that first apocalypse every night they sleep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and R. Scott Baker is a huge philosopher and gets into all sorts of crazy things in these book series. It's kind of the reason why I think they're not as popular, is because they are kind of hard and heavy to read.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real disservice, because he has more books he wants to write, but he has a hard time finding a publisher.
But I will say what's so amazing now is that people, if they have a story, they can write it and you can just get it out into the world. And I really have been appreciating that lately.
It is. I'm trying to release a novel, and I am this summer. I wrote that in 2020. And that was when my first draft was done. And I thought that was going to be the hardest part. And it was by far the easiest, because I was looking for a publisher. And I thought oh, not too many people are just writing books and then not being able to get them out. There has to be a market for this. And there's not even a little bit. And they want you to have they basically want you to come with your own crowd of people that's guaranteed to buy it, is kind of the vibe I got from it. Or you basically are marketing something that is already popular. So if you're doing anything unique, it's kind of going up, upstream in a lot of ways. So I read a lot of indie books, and what actually made me want to write is because I couldn't find what I wanted, because I wanted a mecha book that also included horror. And that just didn't exist especially in the Western audience. And I was like, okay, I was thinking about writing it. And then I read a bunch of indie books, and some were really good. And then there were some of them I'm like, this feels like a first draft. The idea is there, but they need editing, a lot of editing. And I was like, well, they're still getting 5-star reviews, so maybe I can do this. And that's kind of what started my writing journey.
I love that. Write the book you want to read, right?
Absolutely. I beta tested it, I guess you could say, on fan fiction site Royal Roads. And I got good reviews on there. Anyone that I showed it to, they were like, oh, yeah, this is really cool. Never read anything like it. And I was like, all right, maybe I have something here. But still was finding the publisher. And I found Unveiling Nightmares through a friend of mine that I found on Royal Roads. And they want to publish it. So it's coming out this August.
Congratulations. Yeah. That's so cool.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a dream of mine for a while now.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What is the most underrated nerdy thing about you?
I can never pronounce it, but it's the study of butterflies. Lepidopterology. It's probably the most random nerdy thing about me too. Because when I was a kid, one thing that my father did with me was we would get monarchs off of milkweed and feed them and watch them go through their metamorphosis. And that kind of started a long love of insects and entomology and all of that, but especially butterflies and stuff, to the point where one of the oldest books that I have that my daughter actually has now is a insect field guide that I got before I could read. But even now to this day, I have a butterfly box out in my yard that I plant certain things to attract certain caterpillars and all that to have them grow. And I have fennel and all that milkweed and everything. The fennel attracts eastern black swallowtails. Obviously, milkweed attracts the monarchs. I want to get other plants to attract these, and just have kind of my yard be a little bit of a refuge. A lot of them are dying off.
Wow, I would never have guessed that. That's the first time we've had this nerdy thing on the show. That's cool.
Yeah, also because small town, I feel like the nerdy thing was not understood at all. And to the point where I was getting books from the library about insects and all that. And then I had a whole thing where I brought in one of the caterpillars and all that. And there's kids that were calling me Butterfly Boy. It was not intended to be a nice thing. So
kids can be mean.
Absolutely. And being Hispanic in a small town too, and being a nerd as well, adds to it.
Yeah. Well, now being nerdy is cool. And that's what I'm really, really trying to showcase on the podcast. We can just embrace what we're passionate about. And it's amazing, and really nothing to feel shame about.
Absolutely. And I actually kind of experienced that, I want to say my junior year of high school, because I moved from this small town to a slightly bigger small town. But there was a lot more money there. Lockheed Martin had a factory there, and there's old money, mob bosses had houses out there. But it was still a small town. So it had that small town vibe. But there was a transition I experienced of kind of becoming popular because I was knowledgeable about comic books and the Marvel movies were coming out. And,
Oh.
everyone there really kind of valued someone who was good in school and paid attention. And it wasn't as much of the, I don't know, like partying, getting drunk for the hell of it. And that's all anyone is interested in doing as the first small town I was in. So I had this weird kind of like change of like social caste almost when that happened. It was weird to watch because it was a good example of it is in 21 Jump Street, where it shows the two guys when they were in high school, then when they go back, and just how the roles reversed.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
experienced that in a year.
Wow. So you mentioned Marvel. At the time of this recording, an episode came out this week of that nerd thing where I spoke to the hosts of the Vigilante Vibes podcast, and they also run a group called Mediaverse Comics Unwrapped. It's a really great group about everything nerdy, everything Marvel, and what they really try to do is have positivity and no toxicity. So it might be something you're interested in checking out as well, especially if you're a podcast listener.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I've been listening to podcasts of things I like a lot more recently. So that'd probably be something I would enjoy.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said the butterflies was also your most random nerdy thing, or did you have something else you wanted to share?
I have a huge interest in Christian mysticism too. And that kind of plays into a lot of the role of my books because when I first encountered religion, God and angels were just these abstract things that I just thought were words. And then I had a stepfather bring me to like a small evangelical church where he just kind of dropped me off at the Sunday school. They're telling me about this war in heaven and that, the devil is out there and he's always watching, and that they had to make sure that I wasn't the devil because I never came to this church before. So they were like kind of being cautious around me. And I remember leaving there because one thing that stuck out to me was that they talked about how when you are like being possessed by a demon, they look out through your eyes. And then I went with my dad to like scope out trails in the winter for deer hunting. And I got a case of snow blindness. All of a sudden could not see. And I was convinced I was possessed by a demon. But being like 8, I couldn't express that at all and was just basically unconsolably crying.
Oh.
Yeah. So ever since then, like the Christian church has kind of terrified me, and I've been fascinated by that and kind of getting into a lot of the history of like the Crusades and like the weird things that they don't always talk about. And, like there's all sorts of stories that are just downright weird or downright scary. So like when people talk about like encounters with angels in ancient depictions, they're never like the beautiful winged figure. It's always wheels of fire with eyes and all that. And then you'll have that, which is like a cosmic horror nightmare. And then you'll have the saint that prayed to have the children that made fun of him for being bald be punished. So God summoned 2 she-bears and it killed 42 children. Like that is extremely random and weird.
So you've really been fascinated by just like horror and supernatural and all of this stuff since you were a kid.
Oh, absolutely. I remember falling asleep with X-Files was coming on at night. So I was like falling asleep to that theme song, in the background, and then eventually watching that and becoming obsessed with it. And then when I got the internet, watching like videos of people posting paranormal encounters and all that. And I actually had like a encounter that was somewhat paranormal that I still can explain to this day, being as skeptical as I am.
Ooh, well, since this is kind of like a horror theme episode, do you want to share it?
Absolutely. And I actually wrote a short story about it that hasn't been published yet, but is also fictionalized towards the end. I lived on a trailer up on a hill, and the hill was basically situated that there was about a half a mile of woods behind my mom's trailer, and there's houses along that. And then on the other side of the woods, there was houses and farms along that. But there was this vast 3-4 mile long stretch of woods that my parents never cared if I went out into because like, you can't get lost. You'll end up in someone's yard. So being like 15 or so, I was out there hiking along, and I knew most of it by the back of my hands, but it was getting dark and I usually had no problem finding my way back in the dark. So I was just walking in the direction that I normally did. And then in the distance, I saw a light, and kind of knowing where I was like, there shouldn't be a light there. But it's like maybe I got mixed up and went farther than I thought, or not as far as I thought. So I was like, well, I'll head towards the road. And then that's the same direction. And I got to a point where the light didn't seem to be getting any closer. And I was like, all right, that's a little weird. And kept going closer and closer and closer. And then it disappeared, and there was a field there. And I knew where this field was. And the light was on the other side of the field now. I was like, this is strange, because I could see it just beyond the wood line, but it didn't seem to be emanating any light. Like, it wasn't illuminating the trees around it. It just seemed to be just there. At that point, I was starting to get creeped out because I was raised by my
Yeah.
dad, and he was a woodsman and was like, "You're gonna be more scared of anything in these woods than they are of you." And he basically was like, "Make sure you make a lot of noise, and you'll be fine." But one thing he did randomly warn me about one time when I was in the woods with him was to never whistle in the woods. And the seriousness that he told me that freaked me out when I still haven't out whistled in the woods to these days.
Oh my gosh, we're recording this at night. I'm getting like scared.
But anyways, I decided like because the way the fields are set up, there's a lot of like old farm fields that were abandoned, and they kind of keep somewhat maintained so they can hunt in them and bait illegally and all that stuff. So this was a maintained field that was not connected to any of the roads, but there was a small farmer's path that went to their main field. So I walked along the field, and the light followed me along the field. It was the same distance.
Oh,
and
my
at
God.
that point, I was terrified. So I got to the field, and I got to the path, and I ran at that point down the field, and I turned around, and it was at the end of the pathway, and kept running, came to the other field, kept running, and I didn't look back till I got to the road, and it was at the entrance of the pathway. And I stayed there for a little bit, and then it kind of bounced off back into the woods. And I could see it for quite a time while I was walking down the road, just way further out in the woods, and it eventually disappeared. And, random encounter, scared the shit out of me. And I really don't go in the woods at dark too much anymore.
Too much. I would never go into the woods at dark. Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. Woo. Oh boy, I'm going to be afraid walking my dog tonight, even though I'm not in the woods at all.
Yeah.
Wow. So fascinating. So
yeah,
what is this journey into just being a nerd
been
like for you?
It was kind of isolating because I grew up in a small town where everyone was interested in hunting, fishing, drinking, and, the sports. I had all these things that I valued that no one else seemed to understand. And my brother, who was 15 years older than me, was also similarly very nerdy, got a lot of nerdy recommendations from him. So that was kind of something that I shared with him. And he lived then and now far away. So it was not something I could have an active relationship with him. But every once in a while, we'd get together, talk about nerdy things. He'd give me recommendations. That's how I learned to love things like The Walking Dead, the comic, and Invincible, which was my favorite comic for a long time and has just in the last couple of years gotten an adaptation and has been culturally known. And I remember when me and my wife first got together, she was trying to figure out what to get me for birthdays and all that. And she was trying to get me things I was into. And I was in a reread of Invincible at that point. And she was like, "Oh, I want to find a piece of merch for him for this." Could not find anything because it was just this, it was not popular yet.
And then when did you discover that you love to write?
Probably in my late 20s, the last probably 5 years, I would say. I always kind of dabbled in it, but it was always, even though I'm dyslexic and didn't learn to read really till I was 10 or 11, after that, it kind of came easy to me to write. And I was always good at writing essays and all that. And I think learning to read and the way I understood how to read at such a late age kind of gave me a fundamental difference on that in a lot of ways, but it also gave me some severe weaknesses. First time I tried writing anything was maybe when I was about 20, and I just started writing on a page on my laptop, and it never really got to anything because how I thought you were supposed to write was you make an outline and then you fill in the outline and then you write the story. And I did the outline and I got tired of it at that point because I had meticulously plotted out everything. And then I couldn't bring myself to write anymore about it. When I wrote this book, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to write and write and write, and then I'll come back and edit later. And I just made notes on the side of things I wanted to change. And that's when it really kind of took off. And that's when I really learned to love it, was being able to craft a story and being halfway through the book and being oh, what would be cool if I added this into it, and then working that into it and then realizing oh, yeah, that doesn't work with this thing, and being able to change it, just the adaptability of a story. The book I first went to write in 2020 is not the book that I have now.
Oh, I bet. So how does it feel for you to have people read what you write?
Insecure, very insecure, because it was, being, like I said, being dyslexic, it was, I never really felt like what I could write was good, even though I was I got good grades and stuff with English classes and all that, but that's essays. That's different. That I felt like that was You take in information and then you regurgitate it somewhere else. It wasn't something you're making on your own. It's weird to feel like, if you have a friend read a story and they're like, oh yeah, it's good. Like there's always that doubt. But when other like random people on the internet tell you that it's good, when usually the internet is a toxic cesspool, like that makes you feel a little bit better.
Yeah. And so I don't typically read horror, but I did read your story before the show. And I physiologically had a reaction because of how well written it was.
Oh, well, thank you. And that's after I took probably 600 words out of it too to fit the requirements. So that means a lot.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you are using that as an outlet and you have that space to do that, because a lot of people, if they haven't been writing their whole life, they're like, well, I can't start now. And you just had that passion and you did it. Even though you feel insecure, you're still doing it. And I think that's amazing that you're doing it despite that risk of judgment.
Yeah, it's a very vulnerable, because you're like sitting here polishing this little idea of yours, and you're really hoping you're not polishing a turd. And like I can imagine writers like another one of my favorite books is Blindsight by Peter Watts. That was not given any kind of due when it came out, and he said that it made him want to stop writing because it just was not a success. But I mean, it's an amazing book. But you sit here and you lovingly polish this thing. It basically becomes just like a piece of you, and then you're like, hey, check out this thing I did, and that's a very vulnerable place to be.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I have a hard time editing these episodes because I have to listen to myself talk, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? It's hard to put yourself out there.
It really is. And I actually wanted to do like an audiobook version of my book, and then bought the microphone, read a chapter, listened to it, and I'm like, my voice is not for this. I can't do this. I can't do this on my own. If someone else edits it, it's fine, but I cannot listen to my voice.
I know. Maybe you can't listen to it, but I think you'll get used to it. I mean, you just told that story. That was pretty immersive. So I think you could do it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had other friends tell me that too, because I've been trying to open myself up to it more, because I'm going to have to eventually. Writing a book, I can't just hide and hope it gets successful. I actually have to put in the work. Psychotoxin Press has nights where people read and all that. And what is it called? Open mic night. They have an open mic night where they give people 10 minutes to read whatever they want. And I did a few of those, and I got positive reception from it. And that kind of makes me feel better. And I think I'm going to keep doing that and keep trying. And I've been on a few podcast episodes, so I'm trying, but it's an uphill battle like everything else.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're putting it out there.
Yeah, me too, because it was a big hurdle. Because I'm very introverted, and so I was planning on releasing the book under a writer's name and all that, like a completely different name, hoping not to be associated with it, so I wouldn't get that attention. But I realized I kind of have to.
I never really thought about that, like using your own name or not, and I could see how that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it is, because if my book ever gets big enough just to be like on a shelf somewhere in a store, and someone that I knew like comes by and like, oh, I remember that guy. It's a vulnerable piece of you that's just out there, and can elicit all kinds of emotions, or hate or adoration, and sometimes like unwanted attention. Writing horror, and especially since the Christian church is a big thing in my horror book, and not on the good side because of my personal experience, that could obviously, I could probably get some hate mail for that.
You've made it when you receive hate mail.
And that's what I've been told.
So I know you were talking about being like a huge fan of Gundam. So what would you say that fandom is like?
Like most things on the internet, it's toxic, segmented, and there are a lot of gatekeepers. Right now, I'm part of 2 Facebook groups that are fan pages, but also kind of like shit posting pages. And there is like a meme war between them. It's entertaining to watch in a lot of ways, because there's fans of like the older series, but like there's a main chronological series which is called the Universal Century, and that's the one that's been going on since 1979. There's a lot of history there and a lot of good stuff in there. And then there's other universes, and those are usually one-off seasons. And a lot of people that got into it, they'll like the Iron-Blooded Orphans show that came out a few years back, and that was a lot of people's entry into it because it was on Netflix. And a lot of the older fans think that show is garbage, and then the people that like only that show don't get the same thing out of the other show, so they think those shows are garbage. And then it just is toxic, and people, all that. But one of my favorite things about it too is that there is a lot of like fan art in it. And sometimes it's just silly memes, and other times there's people that are making like amazing pieces of art, especially with like the 1979 stuff, which was animated and is not the best of animation by today's standards by any means. But then people will make this art and they'll tackle it like it is a piece of machinery and have like all these details. And I actually got a guy, he was making diagrams that was kind of mocking the concept out of one of the movies that just came out. But the way he was doing it, I was like, this is amazing. This is some of the most detailed. And it was like you're looking at a blueprint that an engineer made. And I've been wanting promotional artwork for my book. So I just reached out to him. I'm like, hey, do you do commissions? And he was like, yeah, I do. And he started making my like own original mechs and stuff for my book. And it's, again, amazing artwork.
So that sounds amazing. But you said the fandom's toxic. So like, is there a space of the fandom that is more welcoming that people can find?
Mobile Suit Breakdown. Go to them. They have a Patreon page. Fans get together around them and support them and talk to each other through them. They are like the wholesome gem in all of this. Okay. But the rest of it is still pretty entertaining. But it is full of gatekeeping.
I think you bring up a good point, though. I think there are a lot of fandoms that have a lot of gatekeeping, and people might really like something and really crave that community, but they might have a hard time reaching out when there is that gatekeeping because they're worried they're not the biggest fan or the best fan, or that other fans might not agree that they're a fan. And so it's hard. And so I'm glad that, in this fandom, there is that podcast and that community where it is much more welcoming.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of fell off after a while because, other fandoms and all that. And then when my wife was pregnant with my daughter, I was like, I kind of want to see what kind of stuff I liked as a kid and see if there's anything I want to introduce and bond with her about. And I was like, well, I love Gundam. Let me check out what's going on with that. And I found Iron-Blooded Orphans on Netflix, and it is horrifically violent and has a lot of really heavy themes, like all of Gundam really, but it is very explicit in that. So that's like, okay, like I really enjoyed this, not something to watch with a 6-year-old. And then that's when I got back into the original Gundam series. And I also got into the Facebook pages about that. And some of them like laud that series as being like the perfect gem of all. And like that's the thing that if you like Gundam, you have to watch. And I kind of agree with them because it's where everything started. Extremely iconic. And I got back into that, and I actually watched that with my daughter when she was 5, and she loved it. Obviously, the horrible stuff kind of went over her head, but she enjoyed every second of it.
How has the fandom changed your life?
It's definitely showed me how even though people love something, they can also seem to hate it. And it, like having like an abusive relationship within like a property almost, and seeing that and being like, I don't want to be that. So whenever I talk to anyone about the fandom and all that, which all of my friends have heard me go on endlessly about, because I'm like the one nerdy person that's trying to get everyone else into things. It showed me that like it is such a big property and that there's so much different parts of it and different things that there's something for everyone. Like it had existed for so long. Different people have added to it. So if you want something that you're kind of like metal friend who likes violent stuff, you can tell them to watch Iron-Blooded Orphans. If you want something that has like a love story, you can watch 08th MS Team. If you want something that is a nihilistic view on war and makes you feel hopeless inside, you can watch Stardust Memory. If you want just a straight up like action-packed but also kind of grimdark adventure, there's Gundam Thunderbolt. Like there's so much. Anyone that gets into it, there is something there for them. It has given me a lot of ways to interact with other people. Like I've had friends that have watched a little bit of it and they're like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I've had other friends that get really into it. There is something for everyone.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We could love things and I think also be pretty critical of it as well.
Oh, yeah. It's been around long enough that there is like questionable things in its history, obviously, like most things. But I think in any fandom, you can love the product without liking its creator, or you can like, hey, this thing is awesome. There is this part. But, besides that, like, it's great. And I think it has a benefit, to humanity, despite that part. Like, there's people that listen to the Harry Potter thing, and a lot of people agree that J.K. Rowling is not a great person. But people interact with what she created, and they can take their own interpretations off of that. And they can have their relationship with that and not the creator. Like Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451, him being critical of TV and how TV has ruined society. but he accidentally wrote a great story about censorship. That was not what he intended. It's not what he wanted, but that is the relationship that people who read it have with it.
What does being a nerd mean to you?
I think it just means being passionate about what you love and being unashamed of it. I know people that were ashamed of their nerdiness, like they're afraid to get into it, and that also kind of creates a weird like isolation for them, because I had friends that were like really into like Dungeons and Dragons, and I wasn't as into it, but I wanted to be a part of it. But because I was not as immersed, I wasn't like in. I feel like that kind of nerdiness is starting to go away, and I really hope it changes, because a lot of nerd culture is getting popular now, and it's going to wane eventually. Like certain nerdy things is going to go away, and I think people are getting tired of superhero movies, so that's starting to go away a little bit. But there will always be nerds for them, and there's always going to be people that love them, and there will always be a market for nerdy things.
Oh yeah.
And I honestly feel like nerdiness does not necessarily mean just like books or comics or movies. Like I said, I am nerdy about bugs and butterflies and like mushrooms and stuff like that. That's a nerdy thing, and like people don't look at it differently because they hold things with different value. Like I would argue that Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno is fan fiction of the Bible, but people have a relationship with it differently because the Bible is a different thing than Harry Potter. When people write fiction of that, they're like, oh, that's silly. But Dante's Inferno, that's fan fiction.
So interesting. It's true. Being a nerd is just about that passion, really finding something you love and digging deep into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now we're going to go into our geeky recommendations to help us embrace our nerdiness. So today I was trying to go with, a little bit of like that horror type theme. And I'm going to recommend the book that I read when I was very, very young, In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories. So they're not too scary. It's a kid's book, but I think the stories in there are just so fascinating. So I recommend checking it out if you're interested. Eric, do you have a recommendation?
I mean, I've got plenty. Like with the horror, the first horror book that I got really into was Dean Koontz' The Watchers. And that's kind of science fiction-y and horror, but it's an easy read. It's something you can just sit down and read. I read it in a day. And it's a good, I feel like, starter horror for people that aren't into horror. I'm just looking at my bookshelf over here. But like science fiction horror, Peter Watt's Blind Sight, amazing. Best interpretation of vampires I have ever encountered. Also like Brian Lumley's Necroscope series, amazing horror. Also kind of science fiction-y. Anything by Adam Neville. I'm always someone that's trying to get people to read and listen to things, so I could sit here and recommend all day. But one thing that I would definitely recommend to anyone that was interested in me talking about Gundam at all is the Gundam The Origin books. It is a retelling of the original story that came out in 1979, and it is lovingly made. The artwork is phenomenal, and it basically fills in any plot holes that were in there, and it kind of gets rid of all the, like I'm trying to sell these toys aspect of it.
Awesome. I'm sure people are writing down all of these names for their list of things to check out.
I hope so.
Where can people find you? I
am on Facebook and Instagram at EM Otero for my author pages, and you can find some of my stuff on Unveiling Nightmares, Psychotoxin Press.
Perfect. So I will share all of the links to those in the show notes for people to check out. Awesome. Again, thank you so much for being here.
Of course. It was a pleasure.
All right, everybody, if you can please rate and review the podcast on whatever podcast platform you're listening to the show on, that would mean so much to me. Feel free to email me all of your nerdy thoughts at thatnerdthingpod@gmail.com. Be sure to follow the show on Instagram and TikTok, if it still exists by the time the show comes out, at thatnerdthingpod. And be sure to share the show with your nerdy friends. And I'll see you next time. Bye.